I was setting the potato salad on the picnic table, the kind with dill and just the right amount of mustard, when I heard it. My husband's voice, loud, careless, echoing across the yard as laughter followed. "If she disappeared tomorrow," he said, beer in hand, "no one would notice, let alone care." The words hit harder than the summer heat. It wasn't the joke itself, it was the silence that followed. No one spoke up. Not his sister, not his best friend, not even my own daughter. I stood there, invisible among familiar faces, holding a tray of food no one thanked me for. That was the moment I knew. I was done being the joke. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply smiled, set the salad down, and began planning a disappearance of my own. The kind you feel in a legacy, not in an obituary. This isn't a happy story, but it's mine. Let me know if you've lived something like it. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so now. The sun hung low over the backyard, casting a golden hue across the white tablecloths and the rows of mismatched chairs we brought out each year. Our family barbecues had a rhythm to them. Laughter, grilling, light bickering, and the same stories told as if they were new. I had marinated the ribs overnight, made my grandmother's corn pudding from memory, and spent the morning trimming the rose bushes so the yard would look its best. Hosting was my silent language of love, one no one ever seemed to translate. Plates clattered, children squealed, and I floated through the motions with the quiet grace expected of me. I smiled on cue. I fetched extra napkins. I refilled drinks before anyone asked. And then I heard it. His voice, my husband of 16 years, carried from the fire pit where he stood among his brothers and cousins. "If she disappeared tomorrow," he said, pausing for a sip of his beer, "no one would notice, let alone care." A beat of silence, then laughter, sharp, amused, effortless. My husband laughed too, proud of his delivery. I stood a few feet away, unnoticed, holding a pitcher of sweet tea that suddenly felt too heavy in my hands. No one turned to look at me. No one said a word in my defense. Not my sister-in-law, not my daughter, not even my best friend Annette, who had known me since college. It was as if I had truly disappeared. Right there, surrounded by 70 people who all knew my name and none of my story. I didn't drop the pitcher. I didn't gasp or let tears fall. Instead, I placed the glass jug gently on the table beside the condiments and walked inside the house. No one followed. No one noticed. The joke, after all, had made its rounds, and they were too busy basking in its clever cruelty. In the kitchen, I steadied myself against the counter, taking in the hum of the refrigerator and the faint trail of smoke wafting in through the open windows. The linoleum beneath my bare feet was cool, grounding. I looked down at the wedding ring I had worn for almost 2 decades. Gold, plain, chosen in a moment of youthful optimism. I slipped it off and set it beside the sink. It didn't make a sound. I had spent 16 years blending into the background of my own life. 16 years of polite nods, of agreeing for peace, of shrinking so others could shine. I had learned to make myself useful instead of visible. But standing there in the quiet hum of my own kitchen, something shifted. That joke was never meant to be funny. It was a truth he thought I wouldn't hear, and even if I did, he was sure I'd laugh along to keep the peace. But I didn't. I wouldn't. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt still. And in that stillness, something powerful began to stir. I stayed inside for a while after that, pretending to check on the pies cooling on the counter. Apple, cherry, and 1 lemon meringue because it was my husband's favorite. I'd made it even though he'd never once thanked me, never once said, "You didn't have to go to all that trouble." That's the thing about some men. They don't say thank you when they believe the world owes them everything. Outside, I could still hear the laughter trailing off, that hollow, rolling sound that sits in your chest like a bruise. The screen door creaked open and shut again, but it wasn't for me. No one came in to ask where I'd gone, or if I was all right. I was the woman who made the food, who cleaned the spills, who remembered to bring extra bug spray. I wasn't the woman they worried about. From the window above the sink, I watched my husband. He was mid-story now, arm thrown over his cousin's shoulder, miming some exaggerated gesture. Everyone around him laughed again. Not the deep kind that comes from surprise or joy, but the shallow kind that follows people who never had to work hard to be liked. He had always known how to command a room. Charming, self-deprecating in just the right doses, sharp when he needed to be. But I had seen the way that sharpness turned inward, behind closed doors, aimed at me in small, careful incisions. Always too subtle to call out, always framed as just joking. Until now. I pressed my hand against the glass and stared at him. This man I had once loved fiercely, the man I had chosen despite the warnings, despite the little voice in my gut that whispered he only saw me as something to decorate his life, not define it. There had been red flags, of course, little things. The way he spoke over me at dinner parties, the way he rolled his eyes when I mentioned going back to school, the way he sighed dramatically when I asked for help with anything at all. But I had convinced myself that this was love, that this was marriage, that some people were just like that. But the joke, that sentence spoken with such ease, in front of everyone we knew, tore something open. Because it wasn't just a joke. It was a revelation. It was the moment I understood that he didn't just take me for granted. He didn't see me at all. He could make a joke about my disappearance, and no one flinched, because to them, I was already halfway gone. The clock above the stove ticked loudly, unbothered by the shift in my world. I took off my apron slowly, folded it with precision, and set it beside the ring. I looked around the kitchen I had cleaned 1,000 times, the home I had held together with quiet labor, and realized something with startling clarity. They were all still outside laughing. But I wasn't in on the joke anymore. The thing about silence is that it doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in, quiet and deliberate, like dusk pulling itself over the horizon. That night, after the last dish was washed and the last folding chair was stacked against the fence, it followed me into our bedroom like an unwanted guest. My husband was already in bed, one arm behind his head, scrolling his phone like he always did, the glow of the screen casting sharp shadows across his face. He didn't look up when I walked in. Didn't notice I was still in the clothes I'd cooked and served in, that I hadn't changed, hadn't showered. He didn't notice the ring missing from my finger, or the quiet distance in my breath. "Barbecue turned out nice," he said, still not looking at me. I paused at the foot of the bed, letting the words settle. Not once during the hours since that cruel joke had he offered an apology. Not a glance, not a whispered sorry, not even a sheepish acknowledgement of how far he'd gone. It was as if nothing had happened, as if I was supposed to brush off being publicly humiliated and laughed at, like some good sport who knows her place. "Did it?" I asked, my voice so calm it startled me. He finally glanced up, brows raised slightly at my tone, but then he gave a casual shrug and went back to his screen. "Yeah, food was good. Everyone seemed happy." I watched him for a moment, the man I had once trusted with my future, my heart, my name. And now I realized how little he had ever truly seen me. I was just background to him. The hands that cooked, the voice that answered the phone, the body that kept the house from feeling too empty. Somewhere along the way, I had disappeared and no one had noticed, not even me. I slipped into bed beside him but stayed near the edge. I didn't reach for him. I didn't say goodnight. I lay there, listening to the hum of his breathing and the soft buzz of his phone. And then, in the dark, I whispered, "Do you remember what you said today?" He didn't answer at first, but I knew he heard me. I felt the stillness in his body, the way his fingers slowed on the screen. "It was just a joke," he said finally, annoyed by the question. Everyone laughed. "Don't be so sensitive." There it was, the same tired refrain. I rolled onto my back and stared at the ceiling, wondering when I'd agreed to a life where my pain was punchline material. I didn't reply. I just lay there and let the silence stretch between us, wide and thick and unyielding. Because the silence that followed his words didn't belong to me anymore. It belonged to him. And one day soon, it would be all he had left. The morning after the barbecue, I woke before the sun. The house was still and heavy, thick with the scent of grilled meat and clinging smoke, like the residue of something that had burned and wasn't quite finished smoldering. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, black and silent, and listened to the creaks in the floorboards, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the hollow quiet of a house filled with people who didn't really see me. I kept waiting for something, some gesture, some scrap of recognition, but none came. My husband slept in. No apology, no mention of the joke. As if I'd simply imagined it, as if my absence in the hours after hadn't meant anything at all. And in a way, I suppose it hadn't. Not to them. Because no one had looked for me. No one had noticed when I stopped circulating, when my place at the table sat untouched. I had spent the rest of the evening inside, folding napkins, scraping plates, listening to my own heartbeat echo against the tile backsplash. And not once did anyone ask where I'd gone. It's funny, the way people show you who they are in the absence of action. I always thought loyalty was loud, fierce declarations, protective arms, angry protests. But it's not. Loyalty is quiet. It's noticing when someone disappears. It's showing up, not with speeches, but with presence. And when no one showed up for me, when not one voice cut through that laughter to say, "That wasn't funny," I saw it for what it was. I wasn't loved. I was tolerated. And barely that. Even my daughter, 18 now, home from college for the weekend, hadn't said a word. She'd laughed too, or at least she hadn't looked bothered. I had spent her entire childhood protecting her, folding her life around mine like linen around silver. And in that moment, she hadn't seen me as worth defending. That truth settled deep in my chest, a weight I hadn't known I was carrying until it grew roots. I didn't cry. That had been drained from me years ago. But I sat there, watching the morning light crawl across the floor, and something inside me hardened. Not bitterness, not rage, something sharper, something cleaner. Resolve. You learn everything you need to know when no one comes to your defense. You learn who sees you as disposable. You learn where the love ends and the convenience begins. When my husband finally walked into the kitchen, scratching his head and asking if there was any more coffee, I didn't answer right away. I looked at him, not with anger, but with clarity. There's a difference. He smiled, that same easy smile that had once disarmed me. But now I saw it for what it was. A mask, a habit, a hollow charm. I poured myself another cup and walked past him without a word. Let him sit in the silence he created. The problem with appearances is that when you build your life on them, you forget they're made of glass. Shiny, impressive, but fragile. My marriage had always looked good from the outside. Christmas cards with matching sweaters, anniversary dinners posted on social media, well-coordinated vacations that made us look like the picture of suburban success. People admired us, envied us even. But that was the trick. We had become a performance so polished that even I started to forget it was just an act. Inside those photos, between the smiling moments and tidy captions, was a different story. One filled with small dismissals, forgotten birthdays, sideways comments delivered with a grin. He never yelled, never hit. But his indifference was louder than shouting, and over time, it wore me down like a tide against stone. You start to believe you're too sensitive, that maybe being unseen is just the cost of staying married. After the barbecue, I walked through our house differently. I saw the cracks, the mismatched lives living under the same roof, the way we no longer touched unless someone was watching, the way I filled space with my labor while he filled it with noise. There was nothing particularly cruel about him most days, just the slow erosion of presence, the way someone leaves without ever walking out the door. And I had let it happen, hadn't I? Smiling through discomfort, laughing at jokes that stung, choosing peace over pride until I forgot what my pride even sounded like. But now, the silence sat between us like a third person in the room, and for once, I didn't rush to fill it. At dinner, I let him talk while I nodded absently, my thoughts miles away. He noticed eventually, the way men like him always do when the attention shifts. He cleared his throat, searching for something to reel me back in. "You've been quiet today," he said, his fork poised above the salmon I'd baked, the one he'd barely tasted. "Everything all right?" I looked at him and smiled, a slow, practiced thing. "Everything's fine." I watched as he tried to read the temperature of my mood, but he had long since stopped studying me with any real interest. Now he was just trying to maintain the peace. Not fix it. Not ask deeper. Just keep the wheels moving. That's the thing about marriages built on appearances. When the cracks come, no one knows how to repair them. They just cover them up with another coat of charm, another vacation, another dinner party. But I wasn't interested in polishing anymore. I wasn't interested in pretending. He had made a joke at my expense and assumed I'd get over it like I always did. But the glass had already splintered. And this time, I wasn't going to clean it up. The first thing I stopped doing was the laundry. It seems small, almost petty, but it wasn't. It was deliberate. He didn't notice at first. There were still clean shirts in the closet, socks in the drawer. But by the third day, when his favorite polo wasn't folded on the bed, he stood in the hallway and asked if I'd gotten around to the wash. I was in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water. I didn't even look up. "No," I said simply. Then I sipped and walked out. No apology, no excuse, just a number. The world didn't end, the sky didn't fall. And he did his own laundry that night, muttering something under his breath that I didn't bother to decipher. After that, I pulled back in quiet, calculated ways. I stopped refilling his prescriptions, the ones he always forgot until the bottle was empty. I didn't send reminder texts about dentist appointments or water the plants on his side of the patio. I stopped waking up before him to make coffee. I stopped asking if he needed anything when I went to the store. And when dinner came, I made just enough for one. He'd walk in, smell something delicious, and find a plate already rinsed in the sink, the leftovers packed neatly in the fridge with a note that read, "Help yourself." He started noticing, not all at once, but like someone slowly waking up from a long nap. "Everything okay with you lately?" he asked one evening as I sat on the porch, a book open in my lap, though I wasn't reading. "You've been distant." I turned a page I hadn't read. "Just tired," I replied. It wasn't a lie. I was tired. Tired of being taken for granted. Tired of stitching this marriage together with thread only I supplied. Tired of being the one who carried the weight of everything while he drifted. Weightless. But more than tired, I was done. He didn't know it yet. He thought this was just a mood, a passing cold front in our shared weather pattern. He thought if he waited long enough, I'd warm up again, start cooking for two, folding his socks into neat little balls, remembering the exact brand of granola he liked. That was always the game. He ignored. I adjusted. He hurt. I forgave. He joked. I swallowed it whole. But the woman he joked about disappearing had already started to go. Not in body, not in some dramatic suitcase by the door scene. I was leaving quietly, piece by piece, word by unsaid word, love by neglected love. I had once given him everything, my time, my tenderness, my trust. Now I was giving him exactly what he'd asked for. A glimpse of life without me. I didn't tell anyone at first. There's a kind of dignity in silence, in holding your pain close where no one can prod at it with careless hands. But slowly, without intending to, I began to unburden pieces of it, only with the women who had already seen through the cracks long before I had the courage to name them. Women who had loved me not because of what I did for them, but because they remembered who I was before I forgot myself. Annette was the first. We met at the library, where we used to volunteer together before life became a blur of schedules and dinners and obligations. She noticed immediately. "You look thinner," she said, not in the way people say it as a compliment, but like a question. I shrugged. "I've stopped cooking for two." She tilted her head, studied me like she was reading between the lines. "Finally?" she asked. And just like that, the wall cracked open. We sat on the library steps that day, coffee growing cold between our hands, and I told her what happened at the barbecue. The joke, the silence, the nothing that followed. She didn't gasp. She didn't try to excuse it or soften the edges. She just nodded slowly and said, "He's always been the kind of man who confuses charm with character." I let out a laugh, sharp and surprised, and felt a weight shift in my chest. Then there was Lorraine from my yoga class. Quiet, observant, the kind of woman who spoke only when she meant it. One morning after class, as we slipped on our shoes in the changing room, she said, "You've stopped rushing out." It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. "I've stopped rushing for everyone," I replied. She smiled at that, a slow, knowing smile. About time. These women, they weren't saviors, they weren't therapists, they were mirrors. They reflected back the version of me I used to be, the one I had tucked away in order to fit into a marriage that kept shrinking to fit him. They reminded me, in small ways, that I was allowed to take up space, that I wasn't crazy, that being dismissed, ignored, quietly belittled, those things count, even when no one else sees them. One afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table writing in a journal Annette had given me, a simple leather-bound thing with clean pages. She had written inside the cover, "To the woman who never truly disappeared, just waited too long to be seen." I traced the words with my finger, tears pooling in my eyes. Not because I was sad, but because someone remembered me when I had nearly forgotten myself. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone. I felt held, witnessed, real. And in that quiet circle of women, I started to remember what it felt like to be whole again. It began slowly, the way most things that last often do. A few lines in the journal each morning, scribbled between sips of coffee and the hum of a quiet house. Not pages, just fragments. A sentence. A memory. A thought I wouldn't have said aloud. They weren't meant for anyone else. That was the point. After years of filtering my words through what would please, what would pacify, what wouldn't make him sigh or roll his eyes, I wrote exactly what I meant. And in those quiet paragraphs, something happened. I heard myself again. I had once been a woman who filled rooms with ideas. In college, I'd led debates, written editorials, planned rallies that got the dean's attention. I was bold. I was unapologetic. And somewhere between carpool lanes and casserole dishes, I'd learned to swallow that voice whole. to shrink it down to something polite and unthreatening. It didn't happen in one moment. It was slow erosion, words left unsaid, opinions trimmed down, truths diluted into palatable suggestions. But now, with a pen in my hand and no audience but the page, that voice began to stretch again. It cracked at first, rusty and uncertain, but then it grew stronger. I wrote about the way my husband would make me feel small without ever raising his voice. I wrote about the silence after his joke, how it hung heavier than the words themselves. I wrote about my daughter, how I missed the days when she used to look at me like I had answers instead of expectations. I wrote about the women who reminded me I wasn't invisible, about how it felt to be seen again. One afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table, sunlight falling across the pages like quiet permission, and I reread what I had written. It was honest, raw. There was anger, yes, but there was also clarity. Not the wild kind that flares up and burns out, but the steady sort that comes from living through something and deciding not to be bitter, just better. That night, at dinner, my husband told a story from work, one of those long-winded anecdotes where he cast himself as the clever hero and everyone else as bumbling background. I listened, but I didn't nod. I didn't offer the usual laugh at the punchline. I simply took another bite of my meal and let the silence fill the space where my approval used to live. He looked at me, confused. "Everything all right?" he asked, tone teetering between concern and irritation. I looked up from my plate. "I'm fine," I said, but my voice held weight now. A weight he hadn't heard in years. A voice no longer seeking his comfort, no longer softening itself to keep the peace. He blinked, like he'd just noticed I was still in the room. And for the first time in a long time, so had I. Before I was his wife, before I became the background to someone else's story, I had a life. Not just the memory of one, but a living, breathing world I had slowly packed away, like delicate china, too precious for daily use. He never asked much about that life. I think he assumed it didn't matter. Or maybe it made him uncomfortable to imagine I had ever belonged to something greater than him. He never saw the framed degree I kept in the back of the hall closet. He never noticed the books I'd published under my maiden name, tucked quietly onto the bottom shelf. To him, I'd always been the woman who knew how to make his favorite lasagna and didn't mind if he forgot her birthday. But I remembered. I remembered who I was before his world became mine. Before I changed cities, changed names, changed pace. I remembered the fellowship I turned down when we got engaged, because the idea of starting our life apart felt too fragile. I remembered the articles I stopped pitching, the lectures I stopped accepting, the dreams I gently shelved so he wouldn't have to feel like he was married to a woman who might one day outgrow him. I suppose I thought that kind of sacrifice meant something, that it would bind us, that he'd see it one day and understand it for what it was, a form of love. He never did. That week, as I sat with my journal and flipped through old emails, dusted off old drafts, reopened accounts I hadn't logged into in years, I realized how many parts of me still lived beneath the surface. Dormant, not dead. A part of me had been waiting, patient, enduring, believing that perhaps one day I'd be given space again to breathe, to speak, to rise. He never asked why I stayed up late that Tuesday night, typing away in the den with a lamp glowing softly behind me. He never thought to wonder who I might be corresponding with when I started taking phone calls on the porch, voice hushed, but bright. He didn't ask, because he thought he knew everything there was to know about me. But his version of me stopped at the kitchen door. The real version had always been waiting, just beneath the surface, too weary to fight, but not willing to fade. One night, I found an old essay I'd written before we were married, about silence and identity, and the danger of letting someone else write your story. I read it out loud to myself, My voice cracked in the middle, not from grief, but recognition. I'd written that voice into the ground, buried it under years of compromise. And still, it had waited for me. He didn't know that woman, but she had never truly left. And now, she was stepping back into the light. There's a strange ache in remembering the woman you used to be. Not a sharp pain, but a dull, lingering weight in the chest. Like muscle memory from a life long outgrown. Before I was his wife, I was someone. Not just a name on a marriage license or the keeper of routines, but a person with ideas that stirred rooms, with ambition that didn't shrink in the face of someone else's ego. I had a passport filled with stamps. Friends who called me for advice that didn't involve recipes or party planning. I had dreams that didn't end in casseroles and thankless evenings. Sometimes I wonder if he ever truly saw her. The version of me before I bent to fit his world. Maybe he saw her once and found her inconvenient. Maybe he mistook her quieting as maturity, or worse, submission. But I had always been careful not to disappear all at once. That's the thing about women like me. We don't vanish. We dissolve. Slowly. Gracefully. Until one day we look in the mirror, and there's someone else staring back. Still familiar, but muted. I thought marriage meant folding into one another. He thought it meant folding me away. And I let him. I let him when I stopped bringing up the job offer in New York because it made him uncomfortable. I let him when I said no to a writing retreat that fell on our anniversary, even though he never remembered the date anyway. I let him every time I put his needs first, not because he asked me to, but because I believed love was supposed to feel like sacrifice. What no one tells you is that when you do that too often, the person you've bent for stops seeing you at all. You become the shape they expect, not the soul they chose. But lately, that shape had started to shift. Not violently, not with fanfare. Just a quiet, steady uncurling of who I had once been. I started saying no. To things that drained me. To people who forgot me. To the endless demands I used to meet with a smile and a nod. I began replying to old contacts, professors, editors, women I'd admired from afar when I still believed I belonged in those circles. They hadn't forgotten me. They were surprised to hear from me, yes, but not dismissive. If anything, they welcomed me back like I'd never left. And maybe I hadn't. Not completely. Maybe the best parts of me had just been waiting, holding their breath. One night, I pulled out a worn folder from the back of the closet, full of articles I'd written under a name I hadn't said aloud in years. My name. My real name. Not the one I signed on PTA forms or greeting cards, but the one that made me feel whole. I whispered it into the still air of our bedroom. It sounded like coming home. The envelope was thick, the kind made of cream cardstock that spoke in whispers of prestige. It came in the mail one afternoon, addressed to my full name. Not the one I used at dinner parties or school fundraisers, but the one I'd reclaimed piece by piece over the last few weeks. Inside was an invitation to speak at a women's leadership summit in the city. Not just to attend, but to take the stage. Keynote. Spotlight. My name. Bold and centered. My words, finally asked for, not ignored or tolerated. I stared at it for a long time, the edges cool between my fingers. It wasn't just paper. It was proof. That I hadn't been forgotten. That somewhere, the world I'd once been part of was still open to me, waiting for me to step back into it. And maybe it had never shut me out. Maybe I had closed the door myself, quietly and without drama, thinking that love meant choosing someone else's path over your own. He found the envelope later that evening, sitting on the hall table where I'd left it. I hadn't hidden it. I no longer felt the need to. He called out from the other room, reading it aloud like a question. You got something from the Women in Leadership Coalition? I didn't answer right away. I was in the kitchen, pouring tea. I could hear the confusion in his voice, the attempt to understand how this had come to me, this thing that didn't fit the version of me he knew. "Are you going to this?" he asked, stepping into the kitchen, envelope still in hand. I turned and took it from him gently. "I'm not going," I said, meeting his eyes. "I'm speaking." His brow creased, unsure whether to laugh or object. "Speaking? About what?" I gave a small smile, one that didn't seek approval. "About disappearing," I said, "and what it takes to return to yourself." He stood there, silent. I could see the calculation behind his eyes, trying to rewrite this moment into something less threatening, less real. "That's great," he said finally, voice forced, brittle at the edges. "Really great." But the words sat wrong in his mouth, like borrowed clothing. He didn't know how to speak this version of me, the one who didn't need his permission to be proud of herself. Later that night, I printed my draft speech and read it aloud in the den. He walked past the door but didn't come in. Maybe he didn't recognize the voice coming from the room. Maybe he didn't want to. I spoke anyway, because the invitation wasn't just to the summit. It was to myself, to step forward, to be seen, to make noise. And this time, I RSVP'd without hesitation. The gala was held at the historic Marlowe Hotel downtown, all velvet staircases and glittering chandeliers, the kind of place where conversations floated like champagne bubbles and everything shimmered with curated elegance. I stood at the edge of the ballroom, dress smoothed, heels steady, and took a breath that wasn't for anyone else. My name, the name I had once tucked away like a secret, was printed on a placard at the head table. I ran my fingers over it. Margaret L. Carrington. Not Mrs. Anything. Not someone's +1. Just me. I had debated telling him I was going. It would have been easier to slip away quietly, but I wasn't hiding anymore. I left the invitation on the counter next to his coffee cup. He didn't ask about it until the morning of, when I stepped out of the bedroom in a navy gown I hadn't worn since before I took his name. He blinked, clearly startled. "You look different," he said, which was as close to a compliment as he could offer now. "I have somewhere to be," I replied, gathering my clutch and keys. "Don't wait up." He didn't follow me to the door. He didn't ask what the event was for. That version of me, the one who explained herself to keep the peace, was gone. At the gala, I was greeted with warmth, recognition. People remembered my work, my writing, my voice. Not out of politeness, but because it had mattered to them. They quoted lines I'd forgotten I'd written. They asked what I was working on next. The keynote I gave was met with a standing ovation, not because it was perfectly delivered, but because it was honest. I spoke about invisibility, about women who disappear inside marriages that applaud their silence, about rediscovery, not the glossy kind you post about, but the painful, slow return to one's own skin. Afterward, a woman in her 60s stopped me in the corridor near the coat check. She wore silver bangles and carried herself like someone who'd weathered storms. "That speech," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just speak it, you lived it." I smiled softly. "Still living it," I said. "But I'm not where I started." I drove home with the windows down, the night wind lifting my hair, music playing low. I felt full in a way I hadn't in years, not because of applause or admiration, but because I had shown up for myself. I had chosen myself, and no one could take that from me now. When I walked into the house, he was still awake, watching television on low volume, pretending not to wait. He looked up at me, eyes scanning the gown, the heels, the confidence I no longer kept hidden. "How was it?" he asked. I set my clutch on the counter and met his eyes without shrinking. It was exactly what I needed, I said. And for once, I didn't owe him anything more than that. The hotel lounge had been quiet after the gala, a low hum of jazz threading through velvet armchairs and the clink of glass. I hadn't planned on staying. I was still wrapped in the warmth of the evening's applause, the conversations that had met me like old friends, the weightless feeling of belonging. But something made me pause at the bar as I passed by. Maybe it was the solitude. Maybe I just wanted one more moment before returning to the house where silence now waited like a second husband. I ordered a glass of wine and sat alone, my heels kicked off beneath me, my posture relaxed for the first time in what felt like a decade. I didn't expect company. I wasn't looking for it. Which is probably why I didn't notice him until he said my name. Margaret Carrington, he said softly, like it belonged in a poem. I turned, startled. The man was tall, silver-haired, the kind of face that aged like time had done him a favor. His smile was hesitant, respectful. We met years ago, at a publishing event in Chicago. You probably don't remember. But I did. Not his face at first, but the memory of being heard, seen, sitting at a round table full of voices, his being one that had asked thoughtful questions about my work. Not about my husband, not about my family, about me. Peter Langley, he added, offering his hand. I was the editor on that maritime piece you wrote, the one about legacy and forgetting. I smiled, surprised at the memory returning like a breeze on the back of my neck. I do remember. You asked me why I chose the word drift instead of disappear. He nodded. You said drifting implied you could still be found. We talked for an hour. Not flirtation, not nostalgia. Just two minds dusting off a connection neither had realized still existed. He asked if I was still writing, and I admitted I had stopped for years. He didn't press. He only said, I'm glad you're coming back. When he left, he placed his card beside my wine glass. In case you want to submit again, or talk. No pressure, just space if you need it. I didn't promise anything. I just nodded. And after he was gone, I sat there staring at the card. It wasn't romance I felt. It wasn't longing. It was recognition. That someone, somewhere, still remembered who I was before I folded into someone else's life. That not everyone had forgotten. When I came home, I didn't mention him. Not because there was anything to hide, but because it wasn't a secret. It was a reminder that the world outside my marriage still had corners I hadn't yet explored. That my name, spoken gently and with memory, still held weight, still stirred something alive. And that maybe, just maybe, I was worth remembering. You said, write the next chapter in 500 words long. Make sure it's in the same tone and writing style as the example. Link it to the previous chapter. No bullet points. Sentences should be in structured paragraphs. No alineas. ChatGPT said, Chapter 14, when he realized I was no longer waiting. It didn't happen all at once, but rather in fragments. Little moments when he began to notice the shift. Not in my tone, not even in my words, but in my absence. The emotional kind. The warmth that used to greet him in the doorway. The way I once leaned toward him in conversation, always giving more than I received. That quiet generosity had begun to dry up, and now he stood at the threshold of something he didn't recognize. A woman no longer waiting to be chosen. It was the following week when he first said it, halfway through dinner, the TV humming in the background, and his fork paused mid-air. You've been different lately. He didn't mean it as a compliment. It was the hesitation in his voice, the confusion of a man whose usual orbit was suddenly off. I kept eating, calmly, like I hadn't noticed. But I had. I'd noticed everything. The way he now looked at me with something like suspicion, as if he'd woken up in a house rearranged by someone he thought he knew. "I've just been busy," I said. And I had been. Writing again. Reading again. Reaching out to people who once inspired me. I had found old pieces of myself like lost photographs in the attic, a bit dust-covered but still intact. He watched me then, waiting for the version of me who would explain, soften, fold herself back into the woman who made things easy. But she didn't show up. She was elsewhere now, standing tall somewhere behind my eyes. That night, he lingered near the doorway as I curled up with a draft of my speech, a red pen in hand, margin notes scattered like breadcrumbs across the page. "You don't sit with me anymore," he said. I looked up, surprised not by the comment, but by the vulnerability in it. A man so used to having me there, he didn't realize he'd stopped deserving it. "I'm sitting with myself," I replied, not unkindly. "It's something I forgot how to do." He didn't respond, just nodded, a little stunned, then turned and walked away. And I sat there, feeling the ache of detachment, but not regret. Not anymore. It was never about punishing him. It was about reclaiming what I had so carelessly given away. My time, my voice, my center. I had built my life around his needs for so long that when I finally started constructing something for myself, the absence startled him. But I was no longer waiting for him to notice me. I was no longer hoping he'd understand. And in that quiet realization, I found something steadier than his validation. I found freedom. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the sort of freedom that comes when you finally stop asking for a seat at a table you helped set, and begin building one of your own. It was a Thursday, uneventful in every visible way. The sky was a dull gray, the kind that makes the hours pass slower, like time itself is waiting for something. I left the house mid-morning with a small leather bag. Nothing dramatic, no suitcase, no heavy goodbye. I took my notebook, my phone, and a sweater. I didn't slam the door. I didn't leave a note. I didn't owe that anymore. He was in the den, half listening to a podcast, feet up, a bowl of pretzels within reach. He didn't look up when I walked past. Maybe he assumed I was running errands. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe he had gotten too used to the sound of me leaving and returning like the rhythm of a door he never had to hold open. But this time, I didn't return. I drove to the lake house my friend Lorraine had offered weeks ago. "If you ever need space," she'd said, "the keys are under the planter. No questions, no explanations." That kind of offer means more than most declarations of love. It means someone sees you unraveling and hands you thread instead of asking why. The lake was quiet when I arrived. The air smelled like pine and memory, and for the first time in years, I felt completely alone in the best possible way. No one to cook for. No one to explain myself to. No one demanding anything but breath and stillness. I turned off my phone after sending one message, to my daughter. "I'm safe. I need time. I'll reach out soon. Love you always." That was all. She didn't respond, at least not then, but I hoped she understood that silence could be an act of love too, especially when it came after so many years of noise. I made tea, opened the windows, let the wind carry away what it could. I sat by the water and wrote without pause, without apology. Pages poured out of me like rain after drought. I wasn't writing to explain. I wasn't writing to be heard. I was writing to remember. The girl I had once been. The woman I had slowly lost. The fire I thought had gone cold, but had only been buried beneath ash. Back home, though I had stopped calling it that in my mind, I imagine he noticed eventually. That the tea wasn't warm on the stove. That dinner wasn't waiting. That the rooms were too quiet, even for him. Maybe he called. Maybe he didn't. Maybe, for the first time, he felt the echo of my absence in a way he couldn't laugh off. But I wasn't thinking about him. I was thinking about breath, about stillness, about the strange and beautiful sensation of not being needed. And in that quiet, I finally remembered what it felt like to belong to myself. The strange thing about leaving is how quiet the world becomes afterward. I had expected guilt, shame even. Years of being the one who stayed, who soothed, who stitched silence into something bearable, had conditioned me to feel wrong for choosing myself. But sitting by that lake, wrapped in nothing but my own breath and the wind through the trees, there was no guilt, only relief. And then, slowly, clarity. I didn't miss him. I didn't miss the house or the rhythms I once clung to. What I felt, more than anything, was the unmistakable sound of space. Wide, unclaimed, mine. I stayed gone for 3 days. Not a disappearance, not a punishment. A pause. A deliberate step away from a life that had demanded everything and given back only expectations. I spent those days writing, not for work, not for someone else's approval, but for me. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the sun sank low enough that I could no longer see the ink on the page. I ate when I was hungry. I slept when I was tired. No one needed me. And for the first time, I didn't feel invisible because of it. I felt free. When I turned my phone back on, the screen bloomed with unanswered calls, unread texts. My daughter had messaged, "Are you okay? Please let me know you're okay." I called her first. Her voice cracked with something between relief and apology. "Dad's been pacing for days," she said, and I pictured him in the kitchen, the one I used to polish spotless, now dull and unfamiliar in my absence. He didn't know what to do. I almost laughed. Of course he didn't. He had built a marriage on the certainty that I'd always be there, even after he stopped showing up. Later that night, I drove back. Not to stay, just to be seen. He met me at the door, his face pale, eyes wide with something he might have mistaken for love, but I knew was fear. Not of losing me, of losing what I did for him, what I kept alive by sheer will. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice tight, unsure whether to be angry or worried. I stepped inside, calm as moonlight. "Away," I said. "And did you enjoy that?" he asked, trying to needle, to find the familiar hook. I looked at him, really looked, and said, "Yes, I did." That silence, the one that followed, was heavier than the joke he made at the barbecue. Because that joke had been cruel, yes. But my absence, it was undeniable. It said everything I hadn't said in years. It showed him the truth he never bothered to ask for. That I didn't need him to disappear. I just needed him to realize I already had. The next family barbecue arrived just as it always did. Paper invites sent, grills scrubbed, tables dragged out under the old oak tree. But this time, I wasn't among the list of names scrawled in neat, expectant handwriting. I didn't bake the pies. I didn't prep the salads or clean the patio cushions. Wasn't there to set the rhythm of the day, to ensure everyone had sunscreen and second helpings and cold drinks refilled before they even had to ask. No one said it aloud, but they noticed. Absence doesn't have to shout to make itself known. From what I heard later, the air was different that day. My daughter told me there was tension, a kind of searching that hovered beneath the surface of every laugh, every conversation. He had tried to carry on, of course. Burgers were grilled, paper lanterns strung up like nothing had shifted. But he was quieter, not brooding, just off balance, like someone waiting for a cue that never came. People asked about me, not directly, not accusing, just careful questions laced with curiosity. "Margaret not feeling well?" She's always so good at these things. Strange not to see her. And he, ever the performer, offered a small shrug and said, she needed a break. As if I were a hobby, a seasonal fixture, something that could be set down and picked up again at his convenience. But even in my absence, I was there. I was in the way the fruit salad was missing the mint I always added. In the mismatched napkins, the slightly overcooked ribs, the way no one could find the citronella candles I kept in the laundry room cabinet marked summer. I was in the pause before the music played, when someone realized I hadn't made the playlist this year. I was in my daughter's quiet refusal to laugh when her uncle made a joke at someone's expense. I was in the way she stepped in, unprompted, and brought out extra chairs for the neighbors who arrived late. Legacy is a tricky thing. We think it's grand, estates, plaques, names engraved in stone. But legacy is often small. It's the way people feel your presence in the gaps, the way your kindness echoes in others long after you've stepped away. I wasn't at that barbecue, but the structure I'd built, of care, of thoughtfulness, of unseen labor, was still holding everything together. Later, my daughter called. She told me about the silence that followed one of his offhand remarks, a joke that once would have been met with laughter. People didn't know how to react, she said quietly. It just fell flat. I smiled to myself as I listened, not out of cruelty, not triumph, just a quiet satisfaction, because that was the moment he realized something he never expected. Without me there, the echo of his words didn't carry. Because without me, the room had changed. And this time, no one was laughing. He thought I was forgettable, that if I vanished from the room, the memory of me would vanish with it, that I was only as valuable as the tasks I completed, the meals I prepared, the ease with which I absorbed discomfort. But what he failed to understand, and what he was now beginning to learn, is that absence reveals what presence never had the space to declare. And mine was echoing in places he hadn't thought to look. In the days after the barbecue, I received messages, quiet ones. A neighbor dropping a note through my mail slot. A friend of his sister reaching out to say she'd thought about me since that day. The joke that landed too hard, too sharp, and somehow cracked more than just a moment. I never said anything, she wrote, but I saw how you looked. I should have said something. The words came slowly, unprompted, and yet steady. A slow trickle of validation, not from the people I had expected, but from the ones who had simply noticed. My daughter, too, had changed. Not all at once, but in small gestures. She started calling more often, her voice no longer rushed or filled with obligatory updates. She asked questions, real ones, about who I used to be, about what I loved before I became mom. She asked me what I was writing now. She said she was proud of me, and I heard it in her voice, the way she now saw me not just as a role, but as a person, a woman, a whole one. As for him, he grew quieter with each passing day. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the unsettled kind. The kind that comes when a man starts to realize that the woman he dismissed was the very thread holding his world together. He didn't know how to say it, of course. Apologies weren't his language. But I saw it in the way he hovered in doorways now, in the way he asked where I'd be, or when I was coming home, as if location could anchor what his love never had. I answered him kindly, but clearly. I no longer belonged to the part of myself that stayed to be overlooked. I wasn't angry anymore. I didn't need revenge or a grand gesture to prove my point. I had no interest in punishing him. The punishment, if there was one, was simple and quiet and devastating in its own way. He had made a joke that day in front of everyone, careless, cruel, designed to draw laughter at my expense. And for a moment, it worked. For a moment, everyone laughed. But now, no one had forgotten me. Not because of the joke, but because of what followed. because of what I became when I stopped letting them define me. He tried to erase me with a punchline, and instead, I wrote my own ending. One where I mattered, one where I stayed gone, and stayed whole. Some stories don't end with slammed doors or grand exits. Sometimes they end quietly, with a woman reclaiming her time, her voice, and the space she was once told she didn't deserve. I didn't leave to make a point. I left because I realized I was the only one who ever saw the value in me. And that was no longer enough. He made a joke at a barbecue and thought it would vanish with the smoke. But jokes have echoes, and mine carried further than he ever imagined. What he meant to dismiss me became the moment that defined me. Not because it broke me, but because it woke me up. So if you're watching this, and you've ever felt small in someone else's story, if you've ever been the punchline, the afterthought, the invisible one, I want you to know something. You are not forgettable. You are not replaceable. And you are not alone. Thank you for sitting with me through this journey. If it resonated, don't forget to subscribe. I've got more stories waiting, ones that will remind you exactly who you are. Because the world may forget your name. But you never should. This story may have ended, but the message lingers. For more raw and real moments like this, click on the left and subscribe to walk alongside more women finding their strength. Healing takes time, but it's possible.